Hello, welcome. Glad to have some of you back. Some of you have been to all of our programs today. And for those of you who are new to this program, we are so glad that you are here with us today. This is our third Holocaust program for today. Eisenhower Preserves the Past by Documenting History. My name is Julie, and I'm an educator with the Eisenhower Foundation here in Abilene, Kansas. So I'm sure that most of you know that Dwight Eisenhower was our 34th president of the United States. But before he was president, he was the supreme Allied commander of the Allied forces in World War II. At the end of the war, towards the end of the war, General Eisenhower and some of his troops had the unimaginable experience of touring a Nazi concentration camp exactly 79 years ago today. The shock and the disgust that he felt compelled him to ensure that the Holocaust be documented for all to know and remember. So today we're going to be taking a look at some of this documentation. These documents are called primary sources because they come directly from those who witnessed the atrocities of the Holocaust firsthand. And we will also see how this documentation impacted the rest of the world. So if you have that primary source sheet that goes with this program, looks like this. You can use it to list the different primary sources that we are using in this program today. An example of the type of the source that you see and how it helped you understand the topic. If you don't have it, that's okay. You can just take notes on a piece of paper. So let's see how many primary sources we can find. The Holocaust is a pretty heavy topic, but I am going to be asking for your thoughts and ideas throughout the program. So please use that chat feature. We love to get your feedback. Katie is on the chat today, and so send her your thoughts and ideas as we go through this program. So we're going to begin with the D-Day invasion of Normandy, France, because that was the event that many believed turned the tide in World War II. As the Allies advanced, Europe began to be liberated from the Nazis' control. The Nazi forces, led by Adolf Hitler, had been keeping the truth about what was happening in concentration camps a secret to the outside world. The Nazis' goal was to exterminate all Jews located in German-occupied countries. This was called the final solution. There were rumors, but no one could really believe it was actually happening. And as the German army was forced to retreat, the truth about what was happening at concentration camps began to be uncovered. So photographs are one type of primary source that we're going to take a look at. So that has been filled in for you on the primary source sheet. This picture of the guard tower and some of the prisoner barracks at Ohrdruf Concentration Camp is shown on this slide. The Ohrdruf camp was the first Nazi camp liberated by US troops. There were many pictures taken at Ohrdruf, and we'll get to see a few of them. The Ohrdruf camp was built in November of 1944 in Germany. Ohrdruf was there to supply forced labor by making prisoners build a railway to a proposed German communication center. However, the communication center was never built because the Allies advanced into Germany. In late March of that year, the population at the camp was over 10,000. But by early April, as the Allies advanced into Germany, the SS, who were the German guards in charge of the concentration camp, evacuated almost all the prisoners on death marches to the Buchenwald camp. Those prisoners who were too ill to walk to the rail cars or to be relocated to Buchenwald were either killed or just left there. This was happening at concentration camps all over Europe as the Nazis scrambled to cover up what they had done at the concentration camps. So on April 4th, 1945, Ohrdruf Camp was discovered by American soldiers. This discovery just really opened the eyes of many US soldiers. They had no idea that these horrors were being perpetrated by the Nazis during the Holocaust. When the American soldiers entered the camp, they found the decomposing remains of hundreds of murdered prisoners, as seen pictured here. They also found the camp's surviving prisoners who were starving, emaciated, and in need of medical attention. So then on April 12th, 1945, Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces, Dwight D. Eisenhower, along with Generals Patton and Bradley, visited Ohrdruf. This is where they saw the crimes committed in the concentration camps for the first time. General Eisenhower was quoted as saying, "Nothing has ever shaken me like this." What the Allied generals found were thousands of naked, emaciated bodies in shallow graves. Eisenhower reviewed various torture devices and a butcher's block for smashing gold fillings from the mouths of dead prisoners. So you need to know that the SS took everything they could take from the prisoners, their clothes, their belongings, their names, whatever they could take from the bodies of the dead prisoners, including gold fillings from their teeth and even tattoos. General Patton became physically ill and could not continue. Eisenhower turned white at the scenes, but insisted on seeing the entire camp. So let's take a look at a few of the things that General Eisenhower saw. This shed was where corpses of the prisoners were kept until they were burned. They were sprinkled with lime in an attempt to reduce the smell. In this picture, General Eisenhower is listening to an explanation of how the gallows were used to kill prisoners. The German SS, who were the camp guards, had quickly made a grid from railway tracks that had been used to incinerate corpses of inmates from mass graves. They did this in an attempt to hide their crimes, but they didn't do a very good job. As you can see, there are still remains there. And this is a photo of the inside of one of the barracks that shows the prisoners' sleeping arrangements on the floor. So very shocking. We're about to see a video clip. This is another example of a primary source document. It was taken the day that Generals Eisenhower, Patton, and Bradley visited the camp.
The 12th of April, Generals Eisenhower, Patton, and Bradley arrive at a concentration camp liberated the previous week by American forces, just outside the town of Ohrdruf. For the first time, America's top generals see the horrors of a concentration camp with their own eyes.
Patton drove in his Jeep, and they stopped, and somebody took him over to the crematorium. And Patton came out of that, my God, he was livid. I have never seen a madder, angrier man in my life.
So as generals, Eisenhower, Patton, and Bradley had probably seen a lot of death and destruction in the war. But the fact that viewing Ohrdruf was more than they could stomach really tells you how awful it really was. So if you're using your sheet, you can go ahead and put that video as another primary source. Let's move on to another type of primary source. So taking a look at this, what type of document are we looking at? It has 3 pages. Go ahead and can put in the chat what you're seeing. Can you find the date up at the top right-hand corner of the first page. So yeah, right, this is a letter. And the date up at the top says April 15th, 1945, 3 days after General Eisenhower visited Ohrdruf Camp. This is a letter that General Eisenhower wrote to General George Marshall. George Marshall was the Army's chief of staff under President Roosevelt. So on page 2 there, in the second paragraph, where it's highlighted in yellow, he goes into detail about his experience at Ohrdruf. So let's take a closer look at that section. All right, so this is what Eisenhower wrote to Marshall. On a recent tour of the forward areas in 1st and 3rd Armies, I stopped momentarily at the salt mines to take a look at the German treasure. There's a lot of it. So I'm going to make a side note here to kind of explain what he's talking about. He didn't go to look at salt. What he's referring to is the artwork and other treasures that the Nazis had stolen and stored in salt mines. So salt mines naturally are very temperature and moisture controlled. And so they're good places to put things like artwork and to preserve them as artifacts. All right, let's go on with the letter. But the most interesting, although horrible sight that I encountered during the trip was a visit to a German internment camp near Gotha. The things I saw beggar description. While I was touring the camp, I encountered 3 men who had been inmates and by one ruse or another had made their escape. I interviewed them through an interpreter. The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality, which he means as savagely cruel, were so overpowering as to leave me a bit sick. In one room, where they were piled up 20 or 30 naked men killed by starvation, George Patton would not even enter. He said he would get sick if he did so. I made the visit deliberately in order to be in the position to give firsthand evidence of these things, if ever in the future there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda. So I'm sure Eisenhower's words were shocking to General Marshall. Why do you think General Eisenhower was concerned about this becoming propaganda? What exactly is propaganda? What do you think Eisenhower was most concerned about here? Put your ideas in the chat and share those with me, please. We know that the Nazis tried to cover up what they did, right? So what do you think Eisenhower meant by propaganda? What might the Germans say? Exactly. Yeah, he was concerned that people would say, oh, no, you're just exaggerating. That didn't really happen. The Germans can say, well, since you won the war, you're just saying these things. But definitely, as we have already witnessed, they were very real. And he wanted to make sure that the rest of the world knew that it was very real. So part of the excerpt that we just read from the letter to Marshall is on the exterior of the Hall of Remembrance at the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. So if you ever get to Washington, take a look. All right, so here is another primary source. Does anyone have any guesses what this might be? Try using the markings on the document as clues. We see quite a few things that are stamped on this message. If you have a guess, put it in the chat. think it was definitely a classified document because we see that it was stamped secret and eyes only, which meant it was not to be copied or photographed, just read by the person it was sent to. So do you see the date kind of in the upper right-hand corner? Any guesses? This isn't something we see every day. The date at the top says the 19th of April, 1945. So again, after Eisenhower's visit to Ohrdruf. Okay, does this communication look official or more like a personal letter? I think it's definitely, it looks pretty official, right? So this is a cable from SHAEF, which stands for Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. Cables were communications sent through cable lines located under the sea. International correspondence and government communications were often sent by cable. General Eisenhower wrote this message to General Marshall, again at the War Department. This is probably one of the most significant pieces of communication because of what President Eisenhower is requesting from General Marshall. So let's take a closer look at what it says. We continue to uncover German concentration camps for political prisoners in which conditions of indescribable horror prevail. From Eisenhower to General Marshall, for eyes only. I have visited one of these myself, and I assure you that whatever has been printed on them to date has been understatement. If you would see any advantage in asking about a dozen leaders of Congress and a dozen prominent editors to make a short visit to this theater and a couple of C-54s, those are airplanes, I will arrange to have them conducted to one of these places where the evidence of bestiality and cruelty is so overpowering as to leave no doubt in their minds about the normal practices of the Germans in these camps. I am hopeful that some British individuals in similar categories will visit the northern area to witness similar evidence of atrocity. Signed, D.E. So, what is General Eisenhower asking General Marshall to do? This was a very important plea. Put that in the chat. What did he want General Marshall to make sure happened?
Find others to come see for themselves.
Right. Find others to come see for themselves. Yes, bring people to document what is going on, particularly, people that have some power themselves, congressmen, the media, right? Well, and indeed, within days, congressmen and journalists began arriving to witness Nazi crimes in the camps. So this was a very crucial and important request that helped reveal to the world what was happening. All right, we're going to take a look at a more personal type of communication. Personal letters, journals, and diaries are yet another type of primary source. The letters we are about to look at were written by Harold Porter, who served in World War II with the 116 Evacuation Hospital in Europe and was stationed at Dachau concentration camp after its liberation. So his job there was to provide care to the former prisoners at Dachau, so the prisoners who had been left there. Harold's letters were obtained from the archives of the Eisenhower Presidential Library. Harold describes the horrors he encountered when he arrived there. And so we're going to read a few excerpts from his letters that he wrote to his parents. This is the first of 4 letters Harold wrote to his parents. As you listen to this letter, think about how these experiences affected Harold, a young soldier who went to war and probably never expected to see these things. This letter is dated the 7th of April, As you can see from the original letter posted here, that date is crossed out and the 7th of May, 1945 is written in. And as we read this letter, you will find out why he changed the date. Dear Mother and Father, you have by this time received a letter mentioning that I am quartered in the concentration camp at Dachau. It is still undecided whether we will be permitted to describe the conditions here, but I'm writing this now to tell you a little and will mail it later when we are told that we can. It is difficult to know how to begin. By this time, I have recovered from my first emotional shock and am able to write without seeming like a hysterical, gibbering idiot. Yet I know you will hesitate to believe me, no matter how objective and factual I try to be. I even find myself trying to deny what I am looking at with my own eyes. Certainly, what I have seen in the past few days will affect my personality for the rest of my life. We knew a day or two before we moved that we were going to operate in Dachau and that it was the location of one of the most notorious concentration camps. But while we expected things to be grisly, I'm sure none of us knew what was coming. It's easy to read about atrocities, but they must be seen before they can be believed. I've seen worse sights than any be described. Do you think as a young soldier going to war, he thought he would ever be witness to the Holocaust? Did you happen to see what this printed on the corner of the stationery he used? So take a look at the corner of the stationery. Do you see up there? What does that say? Where do you think he got this stationery?
SS stationery.
It is SS stationery, absolutely. So he is using a desk that was used by one of the SS guards, and he found this stationery in that desk, and that's all he had to write the letter on. So did you understand why he had to date the letter back a month? Why did he change the date to the 7th of May? So in the letter, remember, he tells his parents that they have to be careful what they say, right? Everything that the military shares kind of has to go through a channel. And so that had to be approved before he could share everything that he had seen. I'm sure it all had to be documented as well. Let's go on to another letter that he wrote. This is an excerpt from his second letter to his parents. It is dated on the 10th of May of 1945. Dear Mother and Father, I've told you before about the thousands of dead bodies here. They are not nearly so ghastly nor horrible as our patients, the living corpses. Gandhi, after a 30-day fast, would still look like Hercules when compared with some of these men. It's unbelievable that they could still be alive. So what do you think he means by living corpses? We know that corpses are the dead. So what do you think he means by living corpses? And how shocking to work with the prisoners who look like that, right?
They are probably skin and bones.
Absolutely right. They look like skin and bones. During their time at the concentration camp, they probably were given very little to eat, if anything at all. They were worked very hard. And so, yes, they literally were probably just skin and bones by the end of the war. We're going to skip to his final letter to his parents. And he describes how the patients and the conditions are starting to improve. This is from the 15th of May, 1945. The patients each had an orange for breakfast the other day. Everyone was excited, but some were too weak to even peel theirs. More and more of them are beginning to look like people and less like animals. We have patient or prisoner ward boys to assist us now, and things are going a little easier. Perhaps you'll see much of this in the newsreels. If so, you'll miss the most grisly part. An article in Stars and Stripes says that the Hayes office has decided you couldn't take it. Love, Harold. So he talks about the Stars and Stripes. The Stars and Stripes was a military newspaper printed for those who were serving in the military. Hayes, that he refers to, was a general in World War II who helped disseminate some of the war information coming out of Europe. So, what do you think would have been the most difficult for soldiers helping these prisoners? Certainly, I'm sure the prisoners were eternally grateful to the soldiers who helped them and showed them kindness. But what do you think would have been difficult for the soldiers? Certainly, it was something they would never have expected to come across, right? Definitely shocking. Yes, comprehending what they were seeing would be very difficult, as Harold had mentioned in his first letter, right? That he couldn't hardly believe it himself, even though he was looking at it, that those things had actually happened. So soon after seeing Ohrdruf, as well as trying to get congressmen and press to visit some of these concentration camps, Eisenhower also ordered every unit nearby that was not on the front lines to tour Ohrdruf. Frank Hamburger was serving in the 65th Infantry Division of the U.S. Army when he visited Ohrdruf Camp, and he described some of what he saw. So this is called an oral history, and it's another form of a primary source, so an oral history. They can be very powerful because it's not just their words describing the event, they are reliving it as they are telling the story. So let's listen to Frank as he gives his account of what he saw.
Well, we were in what was East Germany, and word came down that a camp had been opened up at a place called Ohrdruf, and that Eisenhower and several of the other generals had been there and suggested that every soldier who could possibly see the camp should go. And a day or two later, we were within a few miles of the camp, and I went over. Well, I guess as we came up the dirt road along a railroad track, there were bodies along in the ditch and on the edge of the road, evidently people that had been fleeing the camp and had died or been killed on the way. And then we went into camp, there were bodies laying all around. And there was a small building where they had burned bodies, and walking out around the camp, there was a burning pyre, which is the first picture you have as you come into this museum, where they had burned bodies of the prisoners. And I remember that there was a German plowing in his field up the hill from the crematorium.
So I think it's just amazing that Frank remembers what he saw in such detail. That tells you that it made such a tremendous impact on him. And it's also interesting that he mentioned the farmer plowing in his field next to the camp. What do you think was the significance of that? As Frank was looking at all this horror and devastation, there was just a German farmer doing what he does every day. What impact does that make you feel? What are your opinions about that? So a lot of the Germans who lived in the area of the concentration camps had no knowledge of what was going on. And probably that was true for this farmer. He still had to make a living, right, for his family. And it's quite possible that either he didn't know or he chose to ignore what was going on. Because of Eisenhower's insistence that others see and document what he saw, the world soon realized what had been happening under Nazi rule across Europe. So this documentation did several things of historical significance. It revealed the horrors of the Holocaust that hadn't been known before. It impacted Allied war efforts. So after seeing these concentration camps for themselves, Allied soldiers were more determined than ever to defeat Nazi Germany. And as you see from the quote there, General Eisenhower said, "We are told the American soldier does not know what he is fighting for. Now, at least, we know what he is fighting against." It also confirmed Allied intelligence reports. So there were lots of rumors going around that these things were happening, but no proof until all of this came out, thanks to General Eisenhower's insistence. And it provided documentation for the prosecution of Nazi war crimes. After the war, many of these Nazi generals and leaders were tried for war crimes. Newspaper articles, like you see here, can be another primary source, but that's kind of depending on the source of the information. If it's an opinion piece or not firsthand information, it would be considered a secondary source. If it comes directly from someone who was there, then it would be a primary source. So that's another primary source that you can list on your sheet.
Can we pause for a second?
Yes.
We have a question about the farmer.
Okay, so someone has a question about the farmer, all right?
Students are asking why the farmer didn't smell what was happening there being so close to the actual site.
That is a great question, and I don't think I have a good answer for that since I wasn't there at that time. He didn't say how far in the distance the farmer is, and since he's outside, maybe some of that smell kind of dissipated. But you have to wonder if he ever was curious about what was going on, or ever wanted to do something to help. So I like that question that you raised. Thank you. So going on, Eisenhower never visited another concentration camp after that. And years later, he had this to say about his experience at Ohrdruf. This was from his book, Crusade in Europe, that he wrote. He says, "I have never felt able to describe my emotional reactions when I first came face to face with indisputable evidence of Nazi brutality and ruthless disregard of every shred of decency. Up to that time, I had known about it only generally or through secondary sources. I am certain, however, that I have never at any other time experienced an equal sense of shock." So following World War II, General Eisenhower would become president and serve 2 terms. During his time as president, the Cold War really began to escalate with the Soviet Union. President Eisenhower believed in peace and the use of diplomacy with other nations to resolve challenges. And he lived by this quote, "I hate war as only a soldier who has lived it can." Down in the corner of the slide, you can see the cover of Eisenhower's book. So would this book be a primary or secondary source? Go ahead and put your thoughts in the chat. Certainly, we know that sometimes it's hard to tell with books, whether they're primary or secondary. What do you think about this one? All right, definitely, yes. It is definitely a primary source because it was written by General Dwight Eisenhower, who, of course, was right there and saw everything. Not all books are primary sources. So this is where you kind of have to be careful. Some of them could be written by people who weren't there, but maybe researched the Holocaust. So those would be considered secondary sources. So we have looked at quite a few primary sources. How many different types of primary sources did you find in this presentation? Does anyone have a number they'd like to share? We had photographs, we had videos, we had letters, we had cables, personal letters, and oral history. We had newspapers, and we had Dwight Eisenhower's book. So I think that makes 8 primary sources, right? All right, so this one, I really want your thoughts on this one. Which one of those primary sources do you think was the most impactful? Which one really affected you the most? And why do you think that? Which one did you maybe gain the most information from? Or which one did you really helped you understand what happened? Kind of go back through your primary sources sheet and take a look at the different primary sources that you saw. It's kind of hard to decide, isn't it? They all give some really excellent information about the Holocaust. Some of them were definitely full of emotion. Give you a little bit of wait time.
The first video, the pictures, the letters.
Okay, so the first video, that was very impactful to actually see the generals there, right? The pictures, some of them were very graphic. And the letters. I think the personal letters always kind of impact me a little more because, you know, it's just between 2 or 3 people. And so they're kind of pouring out their hearts there. All right. Before we go, are there any other questions, observations, or things that you would like to share about what you learned today with the Holocaust?
Can you talk a little bit more about newspapers being a primary versus secondary source?
Okay, so someone is asking about newspapers being a primary versus a secondary source. So newspapers being a primary source would be where the reporter or the person writing the article was right there. Maybe they were right there on the front lines, or they were right there at the concentration camp, and they are writing what they saw, what happened. It's, you know, their firsthand experience. Secondary source would be like if the reporter interviewed someone who maybe knows about it or could give some information about it, but the person maybe wasn't directly there. Or a lot of times in the newspaper, you might find opinions or editorials. And that would be one person's ideas, whether this was really good or this was really bad. They're sharing what their opinion is. And so in those cases, that would be a secondary source. That was a great question. Thanks for asking that. Any other questions? All right. Well, if you do have any other questions, please contact us here at the Eisenhower Foundation, and we'd be happy to help you or provide you with any information that you need. I have really enjoyed presenting this program with you today. Thank you so much for joining us and participating in our Holocaust program to learn and experience the importance of primary sources. Please contact us if you need anything or would like information on any of our other programs. Have a great weekend, and we hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.